In the winter of 1879, neighbors in western Minnesota watched an old man do something that made no sense. Anders Vik was shoveling snow onto his cabin. Not away from it, onto it. Every clear morning between storms, the old Norwegian walked the walls of his place above the Loch Kiparl bottoms with a grain scoop, throwing snow against the logs and packing it down with the flat of the blade. He was 71 years old. He worked alone. By Christmas week, the banks stood 4 feet up the walls, and he showed no sign of stopping. People slowed their sleds on the river road to look. A man shoveling out his door, they understood. A man shoveling his house under, they did not. And on a prairie farm in winter, a man's strength was the same thing as firewood. Every hour of it spent wrong was an hour the stove would ask about later. Nobody out there had strength to spare for moving snow in the wrong direction. The old man knew they were watching. He never looked up. He set the scoop, lifted, threw, packed, and moved down the wall. Load after load, wall after wall, as though the snow were hay and the cabin were livestock that needed feeding. By the middle of January, the whole township would have a name for the place, and men would be telling the joke in 3 counties. By the last week of February, they would understand. But that winter was still young, and the laughing had only started. The talk began at the feed store in the rail town, moved to the church steps on Sunday, and settled in, permanent, at Cyrus Pratt's lumber office, where men waited out the cold around a good stove that Pratt kept hot on company coal. Pratt sold that coal. He sold the lumber, too, and he had opinions about both. When word of the old man's project reached him, he leaned back and gave it a name that stuck. "Vic's dug himself a gopher hole," he said. 70 years old, and he's gone to livin' like a gopher. The men around the stove laughed, and the Gopher Hole was born. Within a week, the name had traveled farther than most sermons. Emmett Boyd heard it at the mill. Boyd was a carpenter, 30 years at the trade, and he had built or repaired half the houses within a day's ride. He did not laugh exactly. He gave a shorter verdict, the kind men repeated because it sounded like a nail going in. "Snow against wood," Boyd said. "Might as well pour water on your sills slow." Anders Vik came to town twice that month for salt, coffee, and a keg of nails. He heard the name. Everyone did. The township was too small for anything else. He paid in coins counted out of a mitten, nodded to the men by the stove, and drove home. The banks along his walls climbed a little higher that week, and in the quiet after the laughing, 1 or 2 men found themselves wondering, privately, why an old Norwegian who had never once wasted an hour in anyone's memory had suddenly decided to waste 100 of them. The cabin the snow was climbing had been quiet for 2 years. Gunhild Vik had died in it in the 2nd week of Lent, and the things she had touched stayed where she left them. A blue-flowered teacup hung on its hook by the south window. Nobody drank from it. A garden fork stood by the door, times bright. Anders kept the rust off it. He never planted with it. Their daughter Ingrid wrote from Wilmer once a month, and the letters all ended the same way. "Charlie says the shop needs a night watchman. It is warm work, far, and near us. Come before winter." He read each letter twice, folded it into the tin with the others, and banked the stove for the night. The township had its opinion about that, too. An old man alone at the end of a river road was a worry that belonged to everyone and to no one. What none of them knew was where the snow shoveling came from. It came from Telemark, 60 years back, from a steep white valley and a father who ran sheep on it. One December, a 3-day storm took 11 ewes under a slide of snow, and the boy Anders had cried for them. His father had not. On the 9th day they dug where the dog scratched, and the ewes came up out of the drift, alive, steaming, hungry, and loud. The snow that buried them had kept them. The boy never forgot the steam rising out of that hole. His father said one thing about it, working with his hands the way old men do when they are teaching without admitting it. The storm brings its own blanket. Most men shovel it away. At the time it sounded like an old man's saying, the kind that hangs in a family like smoke. It was not a saying, it was a system. In that valley, they banked the hill barns with snow every winter of Anders' boyhood, and the stock came through on half the fodder the lowland farms burned. It had crossed the ocean in one man's hands, and now, at 71, those hands were putting it to work on the last house he ever intended to live in. 2 days after Christmas, the weather turned traitor. A soft south wind came up the valley, the eaves began to drip, and that night it rained on the snow. By morning, the rain had frozen. The banks Anders had packed so carefully slumped, sagged, and set up into slabs of gray ice that split away from the walls and leaned there like broken gravestones. Pratt got the news by noon and improved on it by supper. "The Lord tore it down faster than Vik built it," he said, and the stove crowd carried that one home to their wives. The old man spent New Year's week with a crowbar. He broke the ice slabs loose, hauled them off on the hand sled, and studied what the thaw had taught him. Then he cut willow brush from the slough and laid a loose course of it along the base of every wall, a foot of springy branches for the melt to drain through. When the dry snow came back after Epiphany, he rebuilt, but differently, 8 inches at a time. Pack, tramp, let it set overnight, then 8 inches more. Wet snow drowns, dry snow builds, and he waited for the right kind, the way a mason waits for mortar weather. The new banks rose slower than the first ones and sat tighter. Emmett Boyd rode past on his way to a roofing job and looked a long time. Cyrus Pratt passed on the town road and looked too. Neither man mentioned it. Boyd came out to the Vik place the second week of January, and he came respectfully, the way one workman calls on another. He found Anders splitting stove wood and made his case at the woodpile, point by point, like a man driving nails in a row. He had spent 30 years opening up other people's mistakes. He had replaced sills gone soft as bread under manure banks left one season too long. He had seen ice get into chinking and pry it, freeze by freeze, until a wall you could heat became a wall you could not. He named the farms. He named the winters. "Wood wants to be dry," Boyd said. "Everything you're doing is a promise to keep it wet. And come April, when all this melts, you'll have a moat around your foundation and a swamp under your floor." There was nothing foolish in any of it. Every word came out of calluses, not vanity, and half the township would have signed it like a petition. Anders heard him out to the end, leaning on the maul. Then he walked to the south wall and laid his mitten on the top of the bank, where it stopped, level and even, at the sill log. All the way around the house, the snow rose exactly that high and not 1 inch higher. "Below the sill, never above," he said. 5 words. Boyd looked at the line, looked at the old man, and rode home unconvinced. But he rode slower than he came. The third week of January brought a false spring, 2 days of 40 above, and the false spring brought Boyd's prophecy with it. Anders found it on the inside of the south wall, low, at the floorboards, a damp shadow the length of his forearm. Outside, meltwater had glazed into the chinking exactly as the carpenter had promised it would, freeze by freeze, a crowbar made of ice. He did not argue with it. You cannot argue with water. The next morning, he tore the whole south bank down to the frozen grade, a week of packing undone in one afternoon, and let the wall stand open to the sun and dry. Then he rebuilt it with a change. Against the logs, he stood a course of slab wood, the rough outside boards nobody wanted, bought for almost nothing at Pratt's own mill, and there was a joke in that, if anyone cared to find it. Straw went in at the base over the willow brush. Only then did the snow go back, packed in courses against board now instead of wood that could rot, with a hand's width of air standing guard between the bank and the logs. The repair cost him 4 days and most of a week's strength. It also made the south wall the best wall on the place, and before February was out, he had pulled down and re-armored the other 3 to match. The damp shadow on the floorboards never came back. Boyd's prophecy had come true, and the proving of it had improved the thing it was meant to bury. Above the woodbox, on a peg, hung a split of ash the length of a forearm, and every evening Anders cut a notch in it. 1 notch, 1 day's wood. Weeks were marked with a deeper cut. It was the whole bookkeeping of the house, and it hung there like a calendar made with a knife. Word of the tally stick got to town, because everything did. Pratt held it up to the stove crowd like an exhibit. "Notches," he said. "Notches never warmed anybody." It got its laugh. The country itself was quieter on the subject. On the slough below the Vik place, the muskrats had built their lodges that fall higher and thicker than any man could remember, and the old men who noticed such things had gone silent about the winter ahead in a way that was louder than talk. The muskrats, at least, were not laughing. On the second night of February, the wind came out of the northwest and worked the dark like a burglar. By morning it had gone, and everything looked as it had. Anders lit a candle anyway and walked the inside walls with it, slow, holding the flame a hand from the logs. Along 3 walls, the flame stood straight as a hymn. At the northwest corner, it leaned. Outside, the bank at that corner looked perfect. He fetched the garden fork from beside the door, turned it, and sounded the snow with the butt of the handle. Thump, thump. And then, low near the base, a drum. Hollow. The night wind had tunneled under the crust and scoured out a cavity the size of a feed trough, roofed with a bridge of hard snow. From 2 steps away it was invisible. To the cold, it was an open door. He opened 6 feet of finished bank to fix what nobody could see, packed the cavity solid, rebuilt the courses, and carried water to ice the outer crust so the wind could not get its fingers under again. Henry Calder, his young neighbor from the new frame house up the rise, passed with a wood sled while the work was ending and reined in. "Looks the same as it did," Calder said, honestly puzzled. Anders drove the fork back into its place by the door. "February keeps the score," he said. By Candlemas the job was done, and what stood at the end of the river road no longer looked like a house. It looked like a white mound with a chimney, a doorway, and 2 windows kept clear like eyes. Smoke came up out of the snow as if the drift itself had learned to breathe. Sleds slowed on the road again. Some of them went home the long way, just to look. Pratt saved his best line for a full store on a Saturday. "Anders Vik," he announced, "is the first man in this county to get himself buried ahead of the funeral." It was a good line. It filled the room, went home in a dozen sleds, and was repeated over supper tables from the river to the county line. At the end of the road, the old man tamped the last course on the northwest corner, hung the grain scoop on its nail, and went in to cut the day's notch. Winter had 3 weeks left to say which of them it agreed with. The country kept issuing warnings for anyone still taking them. The horses had come into their winter coats a month early and shaggy as buffalo. Farm dogs dug their beds deep into the straw stacks and stayed there. Twice in 1 week, the noon sun stood in the sky with a false sun burning on either side of it, and the ice on the slough had gone 2 feet down and was still going. Emmett Boyd, the carpenter, came out one last time before it started. He did not knock. He walked the banks the way he walked a frame job, corner to corner, and his eye missed nothing. The slabwood standing between snow and log, the bank line holding level at the sill all the way around, the brush course at the base, waiting to drain the spring melt away from the foundation. Every objection he had laid out at the woodpile in January was standing there in front of him, answered in willow, straw, and board. He stopped at the south wall. "Whose notion were the boards?" he asked. "Yours," Anders said. Boyd stood a while longer with his hands in his pockets. Then he got on his horse and rode back toward town. And the men at Pratt's stove noticed something strange about the carpenter that evening. He had seen the Gopher Hole up close, all of it, and he had not laughed. February 9th began soft. Eaves dripped at breakfast, and the dooryard snow went heavy underfoot. By noon, the wind had swung into the northwest, and the dripping stopped as if a hand had turned it off. The thermometer in the window of the Railtown store told the rest. 22 above at midday, 8 below by supper time, 18 below at full dark, and still falling, with a wind behind it that no one afterward agreed on except to say that it took the tops off the drifts and turned the whole air white. A man could stand in his own yard and lose his own barn. It blew that night. It blew the next day, and the night after that, and the day after that. It did not gust. It did not rest. It leaned 3 days without lifting, the way an ox leans into a load. Nature had come to grade the winter's work, and nature never negotiated its verdicts. Up the rise, in the new frame house, Henry Calder learned what his proud pine siding had been doing since August. It had been shrinking. The wind found every opened joint and came in thin as knife blades. Frost ferns grew on the inside of the northwest bedroom wall, on the wallpaper Ada had ordered from the catalog. Water froze in the pail 6 feet from a stove burning cherry red. Ada kept the baby in a basket by the open oven door and kept her coat on to do it. Henry fed that stove like a fireman on a grade. The dry oak went first, then the green cottonwood that hissed and sulked and gave half heat for double wood. He had hauled 16 cords in the fall and thought himself ahead of any winter God would send. He did arithmetic that night at the stove door and did not like the answer. The pile was going down like grain in a chute. 400 yards down the hill, the mound at the end of the river road showed one thread of smoke, bent flat by the wind. Inside it, the storm was a rumor. The roar came through the banks, softened to something like a river heard from a hilltop. The stove was drafted low and burning slow. The kettle mumbled. The cat slept on the blanket chest with its tail over its nose, and on the shelf behind the stove, under a cloth, bread dough was rising, because the room was warm enough to raise bread. Anders carried in 2 armloads that day. 2. That evening he cut 1 notch in the ash stick. Up the hill, Henry Calder was burning through wood too fast to have counted it, and the 2 houses sat through the same black night, 400 yards and a whole education apart. Here is what the laughing had missed, and it is plain enough to say by a stove. Settled snow is more air than water. 9 parts in 10 of a packed bank is nothing but trapped air, millions of pockets of it, too small for the wind to stir. And still air is the finest wool there is. Every farmer at Pratt's stove already trusted his life to that fact without knowing its name. It is why the grouse dive headfirst into a drift at dusk and sleep there at 30 below. It is why the ground under 2 feet of snow holds near freezing, while the open field above it will kill a man in an hour. The snow was never the enemy of warmth. Loose and blowing, it stole heat. Packed and still, it kept it. So the wind that hit the Vik place spent itself in the first foot of bank, wore itself down pocket by pocket, and arrived at the logs with nothing left to steal. The ground under the cabin gave up its heat all winter, as ground does, and the banks held that heat under the house like a lid on a kettle. The stove was never asked to do more than top it off, and the banks did no more than that. They heated nothing. They would not fix a bad roof or a lazy man. Left wet against bare wood, they would rot a sill, exactly as Emmett Boyd promised. Banked over the sill line, they were a slow way to lose a house. It was not a miracle the old man had built. It was housekeeping, done to the snow itself. The wind quit on the morning of February 12th, and the sun came up on a county with no fences, no roads, and no colors but two. Henry Calder dug 3 hours to daylight his own door and see to his stock. The cattle had lived. The house had barely earned the word. There was ice on the inside of 3 walls. The woodpile was down to what a man could count at a glance, and he had started eyeing the split rails of his own fence like a thief. When he finally waded down the hill toward the river road, he told Ada he was going to bring the old man back to their stove, if the old man was alive to bring. He expected a caved roof. He found the mound whole. The northwest face was scoured raw, where the storm had spent 3 days chewing on it. A foot of finished bank sacrificed to the wind, and everything behind that foot stood untouched. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and unbothered. The path to the door was swept. The warm air met him at the threshold like a hand on the chest. Coffee was on before he got his mittens off, and while the old man poured, Henry Calder stood looking at the split of ash hanging above the woodbox, notch after notch after notch, and did the arithmetic that changed his mind. A notch a day, 2 armloads a notch. The old man had burned less than 5 cords since November. Henry had burned 11 and started on his fence. He crossed the room and laid his bare palm flat against the inside of the wall logs, the way you check a sick animal. The wood was warm. "I was wrong," Henry said. Anders Vik set the cup in front of him and said nothing at all. The first packing snow of the next winter came in late October, and anyone passing the Calder place saw something new. Henry was banking his frame house, slabwood standing against the siding, the bank rising in trampled courses and stopping, level, at the sill. Ada held the lantern while he finished the north wall in the dark. The winter after that, 2 more farms along the river road went under their own white banks. The year after, 5. Emmett Boyd, the carpenter, never once said he had been wrong, and in fairness, about the wet wood he had been right. What he did instead was study the thing until he owned it, and the houses he framed after that were born with a skirt of banking boards already nailed to the sills. He charged extra for it. He got it. Cyrus Pratt found other subjects for the stove crowd. His coal sermons went quiet, though it was noticed that he sold considerably more slabwood than he used to, and said considerably less about gophers. Nobody called it the Gopher Hole anymore. The name simply died, the way names do when they stop being useful. What lived instead was a phrase. All along that river, banking the walls became one more fall chore, with its own place in the calendar, after the plowing froze out and before real cold, and the phrase for it was, "putting the house to bed." Anders Vik wintered 11 more years in that cabin. The blue teacup stayed on its hook. The garden fork stood bright by the door. On the gatepost, a broken fiddle string stayed tied in a small, tight knot, and no one ever learned why, because no one ever asked, and he never said. When Ingrid finally came out one March, sure she would find what a daughter fears to find, she found the door dug clear, the path swept, and the kettle already talking. The difference between a hard winter and a killing one out there was rarely the cold itself. It was what a man did with what the cold gave him. Most fought the snow from November to April and lost a little strength every day of it. One old man pulled it up over his house like wool and let the winter pay for the wool. His father had said it plain 60 years before, in another country, over a hole full of living sheep. The storm brings its own blanket. Most men shovel it away. Now, the people in this story are ours. Anders Vik never lived, and you will not find his cabin on any map of Lac-qui-Parle County. But here is what is true. The farm papers of that era really did tell families to bank their houses every fall, with earth, straw, manure, and snow. And thousands did. Settled snow really is about 9 parts trapped air, which is why the ground under 2 feet of it holds near freezing on the coldest night, and why the grouse dive into drifts to sleep. In Norway, shepherds really did dig sheep out of snowslides alive after days under, kept by the very drift that buried them. And the new pine frame houses of the prairies really were colder, famously, than the old log and sod homes they replaced. The people are imagined. The knowledge is not.